She was nobody. Just another girl on a bicycle, her dark hair tied back with a faded ribbon, pedaling through the morning mist that clung to the cobblestones of occupied France like a shroud. It was the spring of 1943, and the village of Saint-Étienne-de-Rouvray had long since learned the bitter rhythm of subjugation. The Wehrmacht controlled the roads, the curfews, the food, the future itself. And yet, in the wicker basket strapped to the handlebars of Marie Dupin's battered bicycle, hidden beneath loaves of bread still warm from her mother's oven, lay something far more dangerous than contraband butter or hidden weapons. She carried words, coded messages that could unravel German supply lines, expose collaborators, and coordinate strikes that would make the occupiers bleed. At 15 years old, Marie had become a ghost in plain sight, an invisible thread in the vast, desperate network of the French resistance. The road ahead stretched through farmland still green despite the war, past fields where farmers worked under the watchful eyes of soldiers who treated the countryside like their personal spoils. Marie kept her head down, her posture relaxed, every inch the simple peasant girl running errands for her family. She had learned quickly that survival in occupied France was an art of performance. Appear too confident, and you drew suspicion. Appear too nervous, and you invited interrogation. The sweet spot was a kind of dull compliance, eyes lowered but not shifty, movements purposeful but not hurried. She was a master of this dance now, though the knowledge had come at a cost she tried not to count. Her journey had begun 6 months earlier, not with grand speeches or dramatic oaths, but with a whispered conversation in the back of her father's bakery. Pierre Renard, a teacher from the neighboring village, had asked her father if Marie could be trusted. She had been standing in the doorway, flour dusting her hands, and when her father looked at her, she saw in his eyes both pride and terrible fear. He had nodded once, slowly. That night, Pierre had explained in hushed tones how the resistance needed couriers. Young girls, he said, were perfect. The Germans rarely suspected them, especially when they rode bicycles and carried bread. The soldiers saw them as harmless, beneath notice, part of the rural scenery like cows or chickens. Marie's youth, her apparent innocence, was her greatest weapon. The first few runs had been terrifying. Every checkpoint felt like a noose tightening. Every German soldier's glance a potential death sentence. She carried messages folded into tiny squares and hidden in the hollow handles of her bicycle, tucked into the false bottoms of her bread basket, even sewn into the hems of her skirt. The information varied. Sometimes it was details about troop movements observed by farmers who pretended to be simple and ignorant. Other times it was radio codes, schedules for supply trains, or the names of Gestapo informants whose treachery had been discovered. Each scrap of paper represented hours of dangerous intelligence gathering. And if Marie were caught, not only would she face torture and execution, but entire networks would collapse and dozens of people would die. She had learned to read the landscape of occupation like a hunter reads tracks. She knew which checkpoints were staffed by older Wehrmacht regulars who were wary of the war and wanted only to return home, and which were manned by younger, zealous soldiers eager to prove themselves. She knew the times when patrols changed, when attention slackened, when the guards were hungry or tired. She memorized the faces of the soldiers, learned their routines, and exploited every predictable pattern. The bicycle itself became an extension of her body. She could navigate the rutted country roads blindfolded, knew every shortcut through the woods, every barn where she could hide if a patrol appeared unexpectedly. On this particular morning, the stakes were higher than ever. The message hidden in her basket was not routine intelligence, but a detailed plan for sabotaging a railway junction 20 kilometers to the east. The resistance had learned that a major ammunition train was scheduled to pass through in 3 days. If the plan succeeded, the explosion would cripple German supply lines for weeks, perhaps even alter the balance of power in the region. But the plan had to reach the demolition team by noon, or the opportunity would be lost. Marie had volunteered without hesitation, even though the route would take her through the most heavily patrolled section of the valley, past a checkpoint at the old stone bridge where the SS had recently replaced the regular army. As she approached the bridge, her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to maintain the rhythm of her pedaling, to keep her expression blank and slightly bored. The checkpoint came into view. 2 soldiers stood at a wooden barrier, their rifles slung over their shoulders. Behind them, a military truck was parked, and she could see more soldiers inside, playing cards. The bridge itself was ancient, its stones worn smooth by centuries, and it arched over a narrow river that glinted silver in the morning light. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. One of the soldiers raised his hand, signaling her to stop. She squeezed the brakes gently, bringing the bicycle to a halt. Her legs felt like water, but she smiled. It was the kind of smile she had practiced in the mirror. Shy, but not flirtatious. Polite, but not ingratiating. Just a village girl. A little nervous around authority. Nothing more. The soldier was young, perhaps 20, with sharp blue eyes and a face that had not yet lost its boyish softness. He looked at her with a mixture of boredom and mild curiosity. "Papers," he said in heavily accented French, holding out his hand. She fumbled in the pocket of her worn dress and produced her identification card and her the travel permit that allowed her limited movement for the purpose of delivering bread to her grandmother in the next village. The documents were genuine, procured through a sympathetic clerk in the local administration who was part of the resistance. The soldier examined them slowly, his eyes flicking between the photo and her face. She could feel his gaze lingering on her, assessing. For a moment she was not Marie Dupont, courier for the resistance, but simply a girl, vulnerable and alone. The thought was both a shield and a violation. "What is in the basket?" he asked, stepping closer. His breath smelled of tobacco and something sour. "Bread, monsieur," she replied, her voice soft and deferential. "For my grandmother. She is old and cannot bake for herself." He reached into the basket, his fingers brushing against the warm loaves. Marie's heart stopped. The message was there, folded into a tiny square and tucked into the seam of the cloth lining the basket. If he lifted the bread, if he felt the unnatural stiffness of the fabric, if he decided to search more thoroughly, it was over. She imagined his hand closing on the paper, the surprise on his face, the shout for his comrades. She saw the interrogation room, the cold faces of the Gestapo, the tools they would use to extract every name, every location, every secret she carried in her head. But he merely squeezed one of the loaves, testing its freshness, and then withdrew his hand. He looked at her again, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Was it suspicion? Or perhaps something else? A fleeting recognition of her humanity, a momentary weariness with the role he was forced to play. She would never know. He waved her through with a curt gesture, already turning his attention to a cart approaching from the opposite direction. Marie pedaled forward, forcing herself not to rush, not to betray the relief that threatened to make her hands shake. She crossed the bridge, the old stones solid beneath her wheels, and continued down the road. Only when she was out of sight, around a bend and into the cover of a small grove of trees, did she stop. She leaned against a tree trunk, her whole body trembling. and allowed herself a single moment to feel the terror she had suppressed. Then she took a deep breath, climbed back onto her bicycle, and resumed her journey. There was still 5 kilometers to go, and the clock was ticking. The weeks that followed became a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. Marie made run after run, each one a gamble with death. She memorized faces, learned to read the subtle signs of danger, and developed an almost supernatural instinct for when to abort a mission and when to push forward. She saw friends arrested, heard whispers of torture and executions. The village schoolteacher who had first recruited her disappeared one night, taken by the Gish. No one spoke his name after that, but Marie carried his memory like a stone in her chest. She also witnessed small acts of defiance and unexpected kindness. A German soldier, no older than she was, once slipped her an apple at the checkpoint and whispered, "Be careful, little one." She never saw him again and never knew why he had shown her mercy. Perhaps he had a sister back home. Perhaps he was simply tired of being a cog in the machinery of occupation. These moments, rare and fragile, reminded her that the enemy was not a monolith, but a collection of individuals, some cruel, some indifferent, and some quietly horrified by the roles they were forced to play. The railway sabotage succeeded. The explosion, when it came, lit up the night sky and could be heard for miles. Marie learned of it the next morning from a coded phrase in a message she was delivering. She felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction. The war was not won by single victories, but by the accumulation of small acts of resistance, each one a pinprick against the beast of occupation. She was part of something larger than herself, a network of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and that knowledge gave her strength. But the cost was real. She lost friends. She lived in constant fear. Her childhood, what remained of it, was stolen by the necessity of pretending, always pretending to be someone she was not. At night, she dreamed of checkpoints, of soldiers' hands reaching into her basket, of the moment when her luck would finally run out. And yet, she could not stop. To stop would be to surrender, to accept the occupation as permanent, to betray the memory of those who had already sacrificed everything. The liberation, when it finally came, was both joyous and bittersweet. Allied forces swept through the region, and the Germans retreated in disarray. Marie stood in the village square, watching the tanks roll through, the cheering crowds throwing flowers, and she felt strangely disconnected. She had carried the war inside herself for so long that peace felt foreign, almost unreal. The bicycle, her faithful companion through countless dangerous journeys, leaned against a wall, its paint chipped and its frame bent. It had carried her through hell and brought her back, and she would never be able to look at it the same way again. In the years that followed, Marie rarely spoke of her time as a courier. The world wanted to forget the occupation, to move forward, and she understood that impulse. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would take out an old photograph of herself at 15, standing beside her bicycle, her face young and She would look at that girl and marvel at what she had endured, at the courage she had not known she possessed. The messages she carried had helped turn the tide, had saved lives, had struck blows against tyranny. And she had done it all while appearing to be nothing more than a girl on a bicycle, invisible and unremarkable. The resistance had understood a fundamental truth about power and perception. The occupiers looked at young women and saw weakness, saw insignificance, saw something beneath their concern, and in that blindness lay their vulnerability. Marie and countless others like her had weaponized their own invisibility, had turned the enemy's contempt into an advantage. They had been ghosts moving through the machinery of occupation, unseen and unstoppable, and their quiet defiance had helped dismantle an empire. Her story is not unique. Across occupied France, hundreds of young women rode bicycles through danger, carried messages hidden in bread and baskets, and risked everything for the chance to strike back. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were warriors nonetheless, fighting a war of shadows and secrets. Their bravery was not the loud courage of the battlefield, but the quiet, relentless courage of those who choose to resist even when the cost is unimaginable. They understood that freedom is not granted, but seized one dangerous journey at a time. As we remember the great battles and famous generals, it is essential to remember the invisible rebels as well. The girls on bicycles, the bakers and teachers and farmers who chose defiance over submission. They remind us that heroism is not always dramatic, not always recognized, but it is always necessary. Marie Dupont was just a girl, but in her invisibility, she found power. In her youth, she found courage, and in her quiet rebellion, she helped change the course of history.